Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again. This is another Film Fanatic show. It is about Tuesday, or actually no, it's Wednesday at about 10:56. So yeah, I hadn't been able to do a video in a few days. I kind of got a little bit sidetracked with some stuff in the mornings the last few days, and I had a couple of busier days. So I just uploaded a new video. So definitely check that out. Um, and then I've been going through some other movies that I want to check that I definitely want to do a show on. So stay tuned. There'll be some new ones coming your way very soon. I just put up a movie by Bob Clark called Death Dream. That is a movie that I just recently bought, and I was completely blown away by. I had heard about it, and I saw a couple documentaries where that movie was mentioned a lot, and I was like, I have to see this movie. So I just bought it on Blu-ray, and I was completely blown away. So after seeing that movie, I realized, okay, I need to do a show on the director Bob Clark. He's definitely becoming one of my favorite directors. He passed away, unfortunately, quite a few years ago, but I feel he is such a unique director, and the amount of films that he did and the diversity is just I don't know, almost second to none. So that's what's kind of spurred on this idea of doing a show about Bob Clark. So very very cool. So the movies, I have a few of his movies now. I have a movie, probably his most iconic horror film of all time, or for that matter, his well, he's made some commercial films also, but just to run down the list of how diverse and how talented Bob Clark was. He directed Black Christmas in 1974, which is pretty much the most important horror movie, or the most important slasher movie ever made in the horror genre. I think I've talked about that movie quite a bit. I bought it I think it was about, I think it was about maybe 2 years ago or so, and I had never seen that movie. It was one of those situations, and like we've all had that experience where you're kind of like late to the game, whether it's like a band or, in my case, a lot of the times it's a movie or a director or a band I'm checking out for the first time, or it can be anything. But usually for me, it's like around, somewhere in that vicinity, and you kind of get this feeling of, where you're late to the game, and you're like, you see it and you're just blown away by it, or you hear it for the first time, and your reaction to it is funny because like you're blown away by it, but then you're like, what the hell? Where the hell was I? What, do I live in a cave? How have I not heard this before? How have I not seen this before? And that's happened. That's happened quite a bit because it's easy in this day and age for that to happen in some ways because there's so much stuff. There's so much stuff to check out. There's so much content. There's so much great works of art, really. And in some ways, it's obviously checking out movies, and the way I hear about new movies or directors, and it could be the situation of where, say, I'm discovering a director for the first time, or for that matter, a band for the first time, or I might have seen some of their work or heard some of their work, but I never put maybe two and two together, and I never really dove into it or revisit it in many years. Typically, the way I find out is usually online. I usually come across stuff by listening to either podcasts or YouTube channels, or some. There's like a handful of people that I listen to or watch, and so it comes up a lot. I usually hear it in conversations about a particular movie or director, and then also sometimes it happens in real life conversation, and somebody will make a recommendation or some shit like that. So, and it's funny because the way we discover stuff now is very different, obviously, from when I was a kid. Now it's like, if you hear of a band, you can instantly find out anything and virtually everything of what the band sounds like, what they look like. I mean, you name it, and you can find everything immediately at your fingertips. To a degree, there's no mystery around that part of it. When you get into a band or a film, you can just, the information around that particular piece of art is limitless. And back in the day when I was a kid and you were like discovering music and discovering movies, it was everything was fleeting. You might hear about it, but then it disappears. And if you're interested in it, you really have to like kind of dig deep and do a lot of work to find out what the heck it was or who it was or try to remember this. The title, if you can't remember the title, now it's like it's so easy. And so we get inundated. On the other hand, there's no barriers and there's no like limitations to content sharing and access to all of this information. And on one hand, it's amazing and incredible, but it also does lose a little bit of the magic, when you were younger or when things were a little bit different and you really had to put a little bit of extra effort, to finding out about certain things. But I don't know. Again, with technology, there's always a balance. There's always a good and a bad. It's the yin and yang thing. That's always positive and negative. Kind of thing. That's always there. So I kind of feel like that's a thing. But overall, I think it's better now. I think it's easier. I can come across things a lot quicker. I know from just being a fan, the way I discover things is kind of lightning speed, and I can really get a gist of if I'll dig that particular thing quicker than in the past. And Black Christmas was a primetime example of that. That was a movie I had heard about, but again, I forgot about it, because it was years ago. I never seen it. It kept coming up in various interviews, in various shows that I watch. And then I finally just went out and bought it, and I was just like, what the hell? Like, this movie's amazing. So it's one of the greatest, and I think it's the most, obviously with the slasher genre, movies, there were slasher films that came out before 74. There were films that did have elements of the slasher kind of aesthetic in them. But Bob Clark did something really unique with that film because, if anything, it almost plays out more like a Hitchcock film. And so it's very different, but again, it's very much a down and dirty slasher film. And it's a great balance. And it's one of those things where he took the kind of the idea, or like the tropes of what make a slasher film, and he created, I feel like, this definitive blueprint as to what a classic slasher film is. It was totally formalized, and I definitely would say that I've never seen a film do that before Black Christmas. So it's interesting. That movie became a blueprint, and where people, especially in the world of exploitation, people were copying that model and really influenced by it because they're like, okay, this is a definitive, beginning, middle, and end, and this is how you make a really well written, very intense, classic slasher film. So, I think it's probably the most innovative movie in his entire career. And I'd have to say probably the most important film in his career, but then also in the slasher genre. And again, switching things up here a little bit to give you an idea how diverse his Bob Clark's career was. He also went on to direct Porky's in 1981, which was like kind of one of the first kind of raunchy American comedies. kind of a Hollywood film, a bigger bigger Hollywood film. He's one of those directors that really started, you know, he was an American director. He shot a lot of his films in Canada, worked with a lot of Canadian filmmakers, because the taxes were a lot cheaper. Black Christmas is kind of, he was American, but Black Christmas is considered to be a Canadian slasher film because it wasn't originally. It's a Canadian production, and in the '70s, Canada had an amazing uh, period of just amazing horror films that they were putting out. It was time when you had so many great directors emerging, so many great films, and so he was kind of part of that, even though he was technically American. But the period, that whole decade, I have gotten into a lot of, for instance, David Cronenberg, My Bloody Valentine. So many great films came out of Canada during that time. But he was American, but he shot a lot of his films. So a lot of the times, Black Christmas, for instance, is looked at as a Canadian film, Canadian horror film or slasher film. But he's one of those directors that he made that transition from making these super uber low budget sleazy grindhouse movies to working in, for the most part, working in this big kind of Hollywood arena. And yet he always retained, I feel, his style or his integrity, and a really consistent track record. There's not too many directors. I mean, I've talked a lot about Martin Scorsese, one of my favorite directors of all time. And obviously he started in the kind of the gritty independent world. But and then kind of transitioned into bigger Hollywood films. But Bob Clark, I think, is different because he was, the first part of his career, he was a pure, hardcore exploitation director. So it was a kind of a different thing, but he really made these transitions throughout his career, and he was able to have this total consistency. Um, and again, another film, Christmas Story in 1983, which is one of the most beloved films in the world, really, to watch around Christmas time. I mean, it's a wholesome family film, but it's got a lot of heart. It's awesome, and it's hilarious, and it's a timeless classic. And it's a lot of people look at The Christmas Carol as being one of the, you know if not but one of the most essential kind of movies that you need to watch around Christmas time. And I think it's hilarious and ironic that he made A Christmas Story, but then he made Black Christmas, which is like one of the creepiest and one of the kind of most sinister uh, exploitation movies ever. He also directed Porky's, the sequel, in 1980, and Death Dream, which I put up a review. I did a video of Death Dream a day or two ago, and I just uploaded it this morning. And oh my God, I was blown away by this film. I was completely blown away. I don't know. It's a tough call. You know, It's either my favorite film of Bob, in Bob Clark's career, of all of the movies he's done. I love A Christmas Story, obviously, but as far as his earlier films, it's a cross between Black Christmas, um, and Death Dream, and then also, which I'll be getting into, another film of his, Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things, which is just like completely insane. Insane. I did a show on that film a little while ago. I think I've talked about that film more than once. But an extraordinary film, an extraordinary film. But Death Dream I'd never seen before, and my jaw dropped. I was so enamored with how well that movie was directed, or I should say, brilliantly. It's definitely a grindhouse, low down and dirty exploitation movie, but it's so well done. I feel the same way with any of his films that I've seen, especially Black Christmas. where obviously it has all those tropes of what you want in an exploitation movie, but you see this guy who directed this film, like where it's there's something special going on. There's some serious talent, from the directing or director standpoint, as from watching us from an audience perspective, you're like, this guy really had a clear focus and vision and really high end. It's an interesting thing of like low down, dirty kind of guerrilla filmmaking, but then I also consider the films of his, and I've seen pretty much all of his films. There's maybe one or two I haven't seen, but and especially in the earlier part of his career, where you get this interesting kind of juxtaposition, if you will, where there's the whole kind of low down, dirty exploitation thing, but it's also like high art at the same time, like really high end craft filmmaking, high end craft, like I think of like exploitation directors, like for example, one of my favorites, Herschel Gordon Lewis. Like, I love his films to death. He is one of my favorite directors of all time. I own pretty much all of his films. Throughout the last year or so, I've covered all of the movies that I have of his, and I have most of them. I have beautiful editions to all of his movies. And of course, he was like the king of gore. He kind of started the whole gore, and copious amounts of violence in films. He was the godfather of that. And he didn't take himself that seriously. I think he definitely had a sense of, when you see a Herschel Gordon Lewis movie, you're seeing one of his films, and he had a certain style. And I think for what he did and for what he was, for what his voice was, he definitely was a force, and he was really innovative. But at the same time, it's like he didn't really consider himself to be an artist, and it's all subjective. I don't really think he was like necessarily, I don't know, like he was in the art, he was in the pure mind frame of making exploitation movies, and milking a certain audience. And to kind of regard him as like, oh, well, he's like a serious filmmaker, I don't know. Like, I think that's questionable. I think his contribution to the horror genre is um, incredibly important when it comes to certain aspects, especially the gore aspect of films and introducing practical effects. He was definitely the man, the most pioneering person, and I think he definitely in the horror genre is one of the most important directors, one of the most important filmmakers. But outside of that, I don't know. Like if I consider him like a filmmaker per se, like you know, it, he was really on the fringe. But with Bob Clark, I think he was legitimately a true artist, a true filmmaker. But at the same time, he was very much immersed in that same world that Herschel Gordon Lewis was a part of. So, a real interesting character. I would almost go as far as saying that I regard Bob Clark as being on par, with someone like Scorsese or Coppola or Kubrick. I mean, when you really dig in and check out his work, it's pretty serious. It's pretty serious. So that's how I think of him in terms of like his angle or his body of work. It's very unique and very interesting. Other films that he did, should say Death Dream. The other thing which I just watched, I was completely floored by how brutal the movie is and how disturbing it is and just how amazingly well directed it is. But it's so serious. And check out the new review on Death Dream. I was just blown away. Like the movie's a masterpiece. Baby Geniuses, which is hilarious. He directed that in '99, which is this big kind of silly comedy. Um, and then the amazing classic Children Should Play with Dead Things, which is one of the greatest horror films ever made. It was his first movie. 72. I mean, unbelievable. Unbelievable. Um, he worked for quite a few years, or I shouldn't say quite a few years, but he worked with some really talented people. He worked with Alan Ormsby, who is another figure in the world of film and especially in exploitation, who was amazing. He is such an interesting guy. He wrote and collaborated with Bob Clark on all three of these films that I mentioned. I think he was an actor too, and he also directed films. Very creative. He's still around. He's still alive, and he's one of the most creative people, one of the most quirky and interesting people in the world of exploitation and film in general. Fascinating guy. But I have a couple interviews with him on a couple of these movies that I bought, and he's so interesting. I can listen to him talk for hours. I could. And he worked with Bob Clark in the early stage of his career on all of these classics that I've been talking about. So incredibly important. You know, yeah, just incredibly important. He also did a sequel to Baby Genius. It's called Super Babies, which is hilarious. In 2004, which was one of his first, or one of his last films. Um, Murder by Decree, which I have not seen. That came out in '79, and I need to see that. He also did, which I always forget, he directed Rhinestone with Sylvester Stallone and Dolly Parton, which is hilarious. That came out in '84. My Summer Story. Yes, and getting back to Murder by Decree, that is a film which I believe is about the Jack the Ripper case. I really need to see that. I know I saw it when I was a kid because it was on cable, and I think I rented it a few times on VHS. But Porky's Revenge, he kind of turned Porky's into like this big franchise, and that came out in '85. My Summer Story in '94. Amazing, amazing, amazing figure. One of my favorite directors right now. I'm gonna actively try to buy up all of his movies, especially all the exploitation movies, which would you know I think there's one or two more, but I mean talk about an incredible track record and making some of the most influential movies in the horror genre, but making some of and uh, ma- I think he was a real trailblazer too. Just incredible. So I highly recommend if you see a movie out there that where you see that Bob Clark's name is attached to that film in any way in any of the movies I just talked about, definitely do it. He's a really rare breed. I can't really think of any other directors quite like him in terms of like where he was able to make these kind of big, or make these more Hollywood based movies, but then also do these like super low down gritty exploitation movies, and you know whatever the budget was, they're all really good movies, like really good, and you can see that he kept his integrity, and he could do gory action, disturbing kind of exploitation movies, and then he could do kind of like family comedies, these silly kind of comedies or these really kind of raunchy comedies like with Porky's. But yeah, what an awesome director. And for the most part, I, you know, well, at least the horror of his earlier work, that is a fairly new discovery. Porky's, Christmas Story, a lot of those movies I grew up watching. But he's definitely emerged as one of my favorite directors, and I'm gonna keep my eyes peeled to try to like definitely get his other films on Blu-ray. But can't recommend him enough. I can't recommend Bob Clark enough. He's just an amazing, or was an amazing figure in the world of film, and especially in the world of exploitation. So thanks again. This is Jason Dean, and we will see you next time. Peace.